In January of her sophomore year, a basketball player sustained 2 concussions 10 days apart playing for her school's basketball team. The first happened on her home court when she hit her head on the floor fighting another player for the ball. The athlete did not realize at the time she had a concussion, so she continued to play for the rest of the game, suffering a headache and mild dizziness. These signs lasted around a week, but this athlete, since she was unaware, only treated them with excessive amounts of ibuprofen. 10 days after the first concussion, she was playing in a basketball game in Bryan, Texas, and was shoved headfirst into the wall by another player, causing her to immediately collapse onto the floor. Little did this athlete know, these 2 incidents would greatly impact her cognitive abilities over the next year. They affected her life in several ways. Her symptoms were severe and she had to go through months of doctor appointments and physical therapy. Her family and she would get impatient with each other as she could not follow a single conversation. Her classmates tried to help her understand class discussions, but she could not follow them. Throughout the year of experiencing concussion symptoms, she developed moderate anxiety. This athlete was me. I am an example of the many cases in Texas where young athletes are unaware of the risk and severity of concussions. If athletes are more aware of these, then they will know better how to treat their concussions, instead of continuing to play in a game while injured. As participants of youth sports organizations, it is necessary that they know the risks of concussions before they play. It is therefore the responsibility of youth sports organizations in Texas to protect young athletes from the effects of concussions through means of education, proper regulation, and enforcement of those regulations. Most people, including physicians, prior to the late 20th century, defined a concussion as a bruise on the brain that had very little consequences. It was not until the early 1900s that physicians began to more firmly grasp what a concussion was. The medical community noticed the effects of taking a punch or absorbing multiple blows to the head while boxing. The boxing community was becoming more aware of the effects of concussions and adjusting rules to fit the new information given. However, in the 1960s, the majority of athletes not in the boxing community who sustained a concussion still returned to play without hesitation and without consideration of a possible injury. Recently, professional athletes have started to speak out about the number of concussions they've had during their careers and the symptoms they have suffered. Today, concussion injuries are often in the news. This attention has led to a recognition on part of the athletes, parents, coaches, physicians, and the American public that concussions are a widespread problem. According to the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organizations in 2017, an estimated 42 million people worldwide sustained a concussion. In sports alone, 3.8 million people sustained a concussion, while more than 173,000 youth athletes are diagnosed after impact in a contact sport. These disturbing statistics are evidence of a serious problem that should be addressed, but first, these important terms must be defined. A concussion is a form of traumatic brain injury that occurs as a result of a hit, fall, fierce shaking of the head, or impact. If one is showing any signs of the following symptoms, then it is possible that he or she has a concussion. The symptoms of a concussion are confusion, dizzy spells, headaches, numbness, nausea, fatigue, change in emotion, slow motor skills, blurred vision, insomnia, and sensitivity to light and noise. The age range of students in question are middle school and high school students, old enough to not only distinguish between injury and temptation of being lazy, but also to communicate well with their coaches. Youth sports organizations are functional structures that are associated with youth sports programs. A regulation is a rule established by youth sports organizations responsible for detailed procedure that in this thesis is relevant to safety regarding concussions. A collision sport is one in which athletes hit or collide with one another, often with great force on purpose. A contact sport is one in which athletes may touch and make contact with one another, but with considerably less force. In this thesis, I will be arguing for the different responsibilities of youth sports organizations, which as stated earlier, are education, regulation, and enforcement. The awareness of concussions through education will help protect athletes from the effects of concussions. The youth sports organizations are responsible to ensure this increase of education because they are responsible for hiring coaches. The coach teaches and interacts directly with the athletes about a specific sport through its strategy, form, technique, and game. This direct interaction with the athletes gives the organization a pathway for education of concussions. The organization does not have the same effectiveness as a coach because they are more distant from the parents and athletes. This is why the hiring of equipped and caring coaches is essential to the increase of the education of concussions. As God commanded in the Gospel of Mark, people ought to love their neighbor as themselves because all people are images of God. In this case, if students are unaware of what a concussion is, then they cannot possibly know if he or she needs to come out of the game and will continue playing with an injury. If they continue playing with an injury, then they will be hurting their God-given images. Therefore, the organizations and the employees under them ought to love their participants by educating their athletes on concussions through the most efficient and direct means to ensure maximum impact. The youth sports organizations are also responsible for establishing proper regulations. This includes revising previously made regulations, such as the sideline test, and establishing new regulations to coincide with the new information being discovered by neurologists. Many have already begun revising certain regulations. However, some of the already revised regulations are not effective, so it is vital that these must improve. For proper effectiveness, a regulation must protect the athlete from further damage to the brain, must provide accuracy, and must give athletes less room to misunderstand or misjudge their symptoms. An example of an ineffective regulation is the sideline test. When concussion is suspected, a player is taken out of the game and is tested on the sideline by non-medically trained personnel. The test takes about 2 minutes to conduct, and depending on the child's score, he or she is either returned immediately to play or returned to play later in the game. This is not a good diagnostic tool because each brain injury is unique and subjective, requiring a series of brain functions to be tested. No one can base an athlete's true condition on how well one scores on a concussion diagnostic test. Even the mere presence of a symptom may indicate a brain injury. An example of an effective regulation is IMPACT, a computerized neurological exam that consists of 6 short tests designed to target attention, visual memory, visual motor speed, and reaction time. This is a good test because it gives athletes less room to misunderstand their symptoms and provides accuracy through its computerization. If more tests and protocols such as IMPACT were established, and if ineffective regulations were revised to reach effectiveness by youth sports organizations, then athletes may be able to protect their brain from concussions. As seen through the IMPACT test, there is nothing wrong with some of the effective regulations. However, the enforcement of those regulations is failing. For example, Texas has a regulation that states, quote, "If concussion is suspected, then the athlete must be removed." According to Texas A&M University's study on enforcement of these established regulations, this one is not being enforced in youth sports and is failing its duty to protect athletes. Enforcement on the coaches and athletes must be stressed on the already proper regulations so that better rules can be established more effectively. Regulations are impotent without enforcement, so the organizations must establish not only regulations but systems of enforcement as well. Accountability is important because everyone is fallen and sinful. No one is perfect, so imperfect compliance will occur. Consequences are examples to others by displaying what will happen to a non-compliant employee. They are established so that coaches will be held accountable for their compliance. Since the responsibility of the regulations is the organization's, they are responsible to establish means for the accountability of those regulations. Even though the organizations have the responsibility of establishing regulations and systems of enforcement, coaches must follow the regulations by enforcing them on themselves and on the athletes. As stated earlier, a coach's job is to educate the athletes on proper form, technique, and strategies of the specific sport. Their job is the reason why coaches are also responsible for enforcing the regulations on the athletes. As participants of these sports organizations, the athletes ought to use discernment and enforce those regulations on themselves. One reason that concussions throughout Texas go undiagnosed is because the students do not report symptoms. The reason for this is because of the athlete's desire to continue playing in the game and not being taken out. Students would rather continue to play the game and not let their teammates down than communicate their possible injury to their coach and essentially to their organization. This is wrong for, quote, "Our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within us, whom we have from God, so glorify God in our bodies," end quote. If athletes have the knowledge of how to help their bodies through a concussion, and if both coaches and athletes have a regulation from the organization to follow, then they would be glorifying God by protecting their body. They would do their part and enforce those regulations on themselves. Some argue that the already established regulations are unnecessary because concussions are short-lived and inconsequential. They are defined as mild because concussions are not usually life-threatening. Therefore, they should be treated as mild and not as such a big deal as physicians are making it. It is true that concussions are not immediately life-threatening, but they do have significant effects that can impact an athlete's quality of life. It is not worth risking an athlete's mental health for the idol of athletic participation. Those participants are deceived due to the blindness of the idolatry of the sport. This attitude towards athletes' health and athletics goes directly against God's word, for it explicitly states that, quote, "You shall not make for yourself an idol," end quote. Jesus in the New Testament further says, quote, "Do not store up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroys, where thieves break in and steal, but store for yourselves treasures in heaven," end quote. It is more important to have the cognitive ability to grasp the true meaning of life, being God's athletes, running his race designed for us. Athletes' cognitive ability is protected by these regulations, and if they are shut down by idolatry, then the cognitive ability is no longer protected. It is therefore essential that these regulations be established and education to be increased. Dr. Monroe Cullum, a clinical neuropsychologist, stated, quote, "The pendulum is swinging towards concussion awareness, yet there is so much we don't know about brain injury in middle school and high school students," end quote. This is because the symptoms are so nonspecific and so common that athletes will be misdiagnosed. Some others use this statement and say that it is too difficult to establish more regulations concerning concussions because even the physicians do not know much about concussions. Because of misdiagnosis and the lack of knowledge in teenage brain injury, some claim it is pointless to expend time and money to make sports safer. However, despite this problem of ignorance of concussions, organizations are still able to establish regulations with the information given by physicians from their research. No one truly knew anything about the brain until more and more research was completed about the brain and concussions. As mentioned earlier, physicians are still making an effort to learn more about the brain and to warn the general public about their personal health. It is the responsibility of the organization to revise and establish new regulations to coincide with the new research. While some say it is the regulations that are unnecessary, others have argued to say that it is the sports that are unnecessary. Concussions are too severe to allow children to play in collision sports because if a child sustains a concussion when young, then their future will be at risk. Because of this fear, people have tried to ban youth sports to protect their children's future. While concussions are serious and possibly will lead to long-term effects, sports for young athletes should not be banned completely because that movement is unnecessary. If youth sports are banned, then athletes will not have the physical and psychological benefits that sports provide, such as an increase of coordination, fitness, and self-esteem, and the important lessons about teamwork and self-discipline. It is important that the athletes receive these benefits while playing safe. They will be safe because of the enforcement of concussion safety regulation that athletes follow. Therefore, the banning of youth collision sports is unnecessary. This movement of banning youth collision sports is not only unnecessary, but it is also a movement led by a lack of trust. Trusting God that He will keep the athletes safe through the new regulations is most essential. If those who are trying to ban these collision sports discourage children from playing in sports, then those athletes will be afraid to play that sport. If the athletes are fearful of playing in sports, then their chances of getting injured are raised, and the regulations, the responsibility of the organizations, will be useless. Therefore, athletes need to trust and have confidence in God while playing in their sport, and parents need to trust God for the protection of their children. Considering the education, regulation, and enforcement, youth sports organizations ought to strive to improve in each of these areas. We love our neighbor by educating them how we can be stewards of the image of God, on the effects of concussions, and regulate how we act upon that knowledge. We most of all ought to love our athletes by protecting them through our efforts of enforcement of those regulations. Imagine that our student, our child, sustained a concussion and we as parents have to watch what they are suffering through each and every day. Is this what we want other parents to have to witness? Is this what we want athletes across Texas to be suffering, what I had to suffer 2 years ago? These questions must be considered when we are part of a youth sports organization. Depending on our answers, we must strive to do our work as unto the Lord, and must do everything to preserve the safety of our athletes. The Lord gave us the medical insight to use for our benefit. Let us be good stewards, love the athletes, and love to protect the brain. Thank you.
This afternoon, Pastor John Young and Mr. John Whiteroad, and I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Young to begin the questions.
Good afternoon, Mackenzie. Great job.
Thank you.
Proud of you. You did really well. You didn't mention equipment. What role does equipment play in preventing concussions in contact sports?
I believe that equipment is essential to the protection of brain injury in sports. However, it is also the responsibility of those organizations to get that proper equipment for those athletes to use to protect their brains from concussions.
Why did you not feel it important to encourage equipment in contact sports? For instance, in football, in 7-on-7, they've gone to the sports bonnets where they're protecting their heads. Do you think that something like that would be suitable for basketball?
I don't think so, really. I don't think that just because of the regulations that are specific for basketball, I don't think that, like, say, football helmets would be essential or necessary in basketball.
Okay. Where is the biggest roadblock to treating concussions with the seriousness that they need to be? Where should we be focusing our education? On the athlete, on the coach, on the organization, or on the parent?
I say all of them. I say that because I feel like that every single branch of that, like, spiral down to the athlete, I think that if it starts with the organizations, and if they know about education and about concussions, then they can pass it down to their coach, and the coach can pass it down to the parents and athletes. So all of them need to be educated.
I thought your introduction was very effective.
Thank you.
Bringing us into your situation. Personally, for you, what happened to cause you to stop from overlooking concussions and just ignoring it and hoping things will get better or assume that it'll get better, to here we are, you're spending an entire school year writing about it and trying to convince people of the seriousness of it?
The thing that impacted me the most about what had happened was that year of experiencing the concussion symptoms. Beforehand, I was playing basketball, I was in volleyball, I was basically in everything. And before that, I'm the kind of person who kind of just wants to keep pushing through it, and it's just a headache, no big deal, and just move on. But the thing that impacted me the most was that second concussion. Whenever it hit me that bad, and I couldn't go back to my season. My year was really rough on me cognitively, and honestly spiritually, and it was not fun to deal with, and I don't want other athletes who have the same mindset as me to be going into sports unaware that this happens, and it's, and I don't want them thinking that, oh, that wasn't me, that was someone else, that can't happen to me, when it can happen to everyone.
Do you think that personal experience and the anecdotes that you've gone through, do you think that that is the most effective means of communicating the seriousness of concussions? Or do you think that sharing medical findings and the influence, the evidence of studies, which do you think is more effective in convincing a contemporary of yours, a senior or a junior or even a freshman in high school? What's the most effective way to communicate with these kids?
I would say that they're both effective in their own ways, where it's like medical studies show that, the different statistics of how many people get concussions, or like what they're doing to improve concussions. But at the same time, I believe that personal experience, and then let's say like my best friend was asking me questions about concussions, and I would tell her about my personal experience, and she would know somebody who went through that, and her being a friend of mine probably like saw my struggles through that, and so I believe they're both effective in their own different ways.
Finally, in your research, did you read anything about percentages of athletes who don't seek medical attention after a perceived concussion? Are people reaching out to physicians, or are they just trying to deal with it themselves?
Let me look through my longer version and see if I had said anything in relation to that.
I don't believe you have. I was just wondering if kids are really seeking out doctors, or if they're just trying to deal with it with their coach or their parents, or are they going, no, we need to go get checked out? How long, for instance, in your situation, did you just start talking about it with your parents, or did you go, Mom and Dad, I gotta go get checked out? How long did that process take for you?
Whenever I got hit, it was a Tuesday, and we had waited about a week, and I remember this anyway. I really don't remember a lot of what happened right after it happened. So I just remember I had gone to the doctor pretty soon afterwards, and they had basically told me that I can't go back to sports. I don't remember if it was, like, I believe it was my parents who had looked at me and said, this isn't you. And they had noticed different things about me that wasn't right. I felt like I was not right in the head either. But I just felt like, I think I collaborated more with my family than like right before I went to the doctor about it.
Great. So keeping those lines of communication open are critical in a situation like this. We've got to educate athletes to be in communication with their parents on these things, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Mr. Whitebrook?
Thanks. Mackenzie, like Pastor Young said, you drew me in right from the start. Great introduction. You drew me in, and your passion was clear throughout the whole presentation. You're very clear in your diction. I really loved it.
Thank you.
You also helped with me because I have a daughter that had 2 concussions playing basketball at Providence, and later I coached the girls basketball team. So you're speaking to me through this whole process. But let me ask you a question. you're at the TAPS symposium addressing concussion. Ask Miss Meese, what should our sideline protocol be, let's say in girls basketball, if someone is suspected of having a concussion?
Okay. What I would respond to that is that sideline tests and like sideline protocols aren't that effective, mainly because I researched on how long sometimes that concussions, like their symptoms don't start developing until 24-hour to 72-hour periods at times. And in order to catch a concussion, you need symptoms in order to prove that, oh, she actually has a concussion. So I would say that the only like protocol regarding that should just be basically when in doubt, sit them out. Like if you think they have a concussion because you saw them hit their head on the floor, you remove them and you can't let them in for the rest of the game. And then they should get checked out like a day or two later, like by a physician.
So then would they be suspended from playing if they're cleared by what you're advocating?
Could you repeat that question?
So in this instance, someone, a concussion, you say the sideline protocol is not real accurate, they should go a day or two later and talk with someone. Should they be able to play their next game?
It depends. It depends on if the game is like the next day and they still haven't talked to a doctor about if they had a concussion or not. I'd say don't let them into a game until they have a doctor's note and they said, hey, I went to a doctor and they said I have a concussion, I can't play for another 2 weeks or something.
Okay, not to cast aspersions on coaches, me being one, your dad being one, and I think your mom as well, but sometimes it may be difficult for us as coaches to, when our star point guard gets hurt in the championship game, and maybe it's a question whether they're really concussed or not, and I'm the coach, I say, she'll tough it out, just get back in there, Mackenzie, keep playing. You didn't mention anything about the role of a referee. Could the role of a referee be, hopefully they're less biased than the coach? Can you speak to maybe having the referee as part of this group of people looking into it?
Well, absolutely, because referees are employees of a youth sports organizations. Like in order for you to have a game in the first place, you would need referees to come judge it, basically. And I think that they should also be educated on concussions, and they should enforce those regulations on the coaches and the athletes as well, because they are part of that organization.
Okay. Good point. In fact, I think it may have been Baylor. Some college team had their quarterback hurt, potentially concussed. The coach is going to put him back in, and the referee stopped it. And I think the referee has less of a bias than the coach. All right, you mentioned about the sideline test and not being accurate. You said that in your paper that we read, but there was no real documentation on that. Can you elaborate a little bit more on it?
I believe I can. Let me get to that in my long thesis to see exactly what I said and elaborate on that. Okay, what did I say? Okay. I more meant when I said that it's not accurate, part of it is because the sideline test is like the same exact 2-minute like exam, and it only tests like one function of the brain. And as we all know, the brain does a bunch of different functions for your movement, for your cognitive thinking, and everything basically. And if only one brain function, like if only motor skills were tested, then how would we know how affected the cognitive ability is, or vice versa? And I think that's why I think it's not accurate, is because it only tests one function.
Okay. Next, I would love to see you, bring this information to, say, TAPS. I think they could use it, and I personally thoroughly enjoyed it. I could ask you questions for the next hour and a half, but they won't let me, other than I'll just really enjoyed it. Again, you're passionate about it. Your passion came through very clearly, and it's a very timely subject as well. So thank you, Mackenzie.
Thank you.
A lot to be proud of.
Thank you.
Yeah, with myself, Mackenzie, I want to commend you for talking about a topic that is personally relevant to you. That's an important thing, I think, for life. The book of 1 Corinthians, very first chapter, starts by saying that we are to comfort others from the comfort that God has given us, and then gives us a little bit of a basis for suffering. Why we suffer is so that with the comfort we have received in that suffering, we can comfort others. So I want to encourage you to continue to do that with all your life experiences. And thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and I want to thank the interlocutors as well for some very good questions, and encourage them to continue the conversation, as Mr. Whitebrook appropriately said. Thank you again. The meeting ends here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was excellent, Mackenzie.
Thank you.
All right. Well, God be with all of you. We will.